On the morning of February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran. The operation was called Epic Fury. It targeted military installations, nuclear facilities, and Iranian leadership. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the strikes. Within hours, Iran launched missile barrages on Israeli cities and U.S. military bases across the Gulf, in the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain. Hezbollah opened fire into northern Israel from Lebanon. Israel struck back. The region went from tense to active war in less than 12 hours. And then, on March 4th, Iran did what military planners had quietly feared for decades. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. Not with a full naval blockade at first. It started with a declaration from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, that the strait was closed to any vessel affiliated with the United States, Israel, or their allies. Iranian gunboats began boarding and attacking ships. Sea mines appeared in the water. Tanker traffic, which normally moves more than 100 ships through that passage every day, collapsed almost immediately. Within a week, the International Energy Agency was calling it the greatest global energy security challenge in history. That is not a phrase the IEA uses lightly. And yet, despite all of this, despite what is now widely acknowledged as the largest oil supply disruption ever recorded, many people still don't fully understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is, why closing it shook every economy on Earth, what has happened since March, and what the fragile 60-day ceasefire clock that is ticking right now actually means for the world. That is what this video is going to cover. All of it. So let's start with the geography, because the numbers here are extraordinary and most people don't know them. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow passage of water that connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and then to the open Arabian Sea. At its narrowest point, it is 21 miles wide. That's it, 21 miles. And through that 21-mile gap, before February 28th, the world was moving roughly 20 million barrels of oil and oil products every single day. To put that in perspective, global oil consumption runs at around 100 million barrels per day. So 1 in every 5 barrels of oil consumed anywhere on Earth was passing through a stretch of water that, at its narrowest, you could drive across in about 25 minutes on a highway. It gets more specific than that. The strait is the primary or only export route for the oil produced by Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Iran. Of those countries, only Saudi Arabia and the UAE have pipelines capable of bypassing the strait entirely. And even those pipelines, at full capacity, can only move around 5.7 million barrels per day combined. That leaves approximately 14 million barrels per day with absolutely no alternative route to market. Then there is the gas. Qatar is the world's second largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, LNG. Its Ras Laffan facility was, before March 2026, the largest LNG liquefaction complex on Earth. In 2025, Qatar exported over 112 billion cubic meters of LNG. 93% of it transited the Strait of Hormuz. There is no pipeline alternative. There is no other route. If the strait closes, Qatar's LNG exports stop. Full stop. The numbers on destination are equally striking. In 2024, approximately 84% of the crude oil and condensate flowing through the strait was going to Asia. China received about a third of its total oil supply via the strait. Japan depended on it for roughly 70% of its Middle East crude. India, South Korea, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Philippines, all heavily exposed. Europe gets around 12 to 14% of its LNG from Qatar through the strait, with Italy, Belgium, and Poland most exposed. And beyond oil and gas, there is more. Up to 30% of globally traded fertilizers, urea, ammonia, phosphate, transit the strait. Around 8% of the world's aluminum supply comes from Gulf smelters and moves through it. About half of global seaborne sulfur trade passes through it. Sulfuric acid, used to refine petroleum and process critical minerals like copper, nickel, and zinc, passes through it. When people say the Strait of Hormuz is the world's most important energy choke point, they are not being dramatic. There is no other single waterway on Earth whose disruption would simultaneously hit oil, gas, fertilizer, aluminum, sulfur, and food supply chains all at once. And on March 4th, 2026, Iran closed it. Now, here is something that does not get discussed enough. Before the February 28th strikes, the Joint Chiefs of Staff briefed President Trump directly on what would happen. They warned him explicitly that an attack on Iran would very likely cause Iran to close the Strait of Hormuz. They laid out the economic consequences. Trump acknowledged the warnings. And then, according to reporting at the time, he dismissed the possibility, telling his team that Iran would likely capitulate rather than close the strait, and that if they did, the U.S. military could open it again quickly. That assumption was wrong on both counts. Iran did not capitulate. It closed the strait. And reopening it turned out to be far more complicated than any military planner wanted to admit publicly, because Iran's tools for keeping the strait closed are cheap, hard to counter, and brutally effective. Drones, sea mines, small attack boats, anti-ship missiles. Iran does not need to defeat the U.S. Navy in a conventional engagement. It just needs to make the strait too dangerous and too expensive for commercial shipping to use. War risk insurance premiums on tankers, which were 0.125% of ship value per transit before the war, jumped to between 0.2% and 0.4% within days of the conflict starting. For a very large crude oil tanker, that is $250,000 extra per trip. And that is before you account for the actual risk of your crew being killed or your ship being attacked. Insurance underwriters simply stopped writing policies for strait transits. Seafarers refused to sail through. Without insurance, no commercial shipping company will send its vessels into an active war zone. The strait was effectively closed not because Iran sank the entire merchant fleet, but because the economic and human risk of transiting it was higher than any company was willing to bear. This is the key insight that most coverage of the Hormuz crisis missed. You do not need to win a battle to close a strait. You just need to make it uninsurable. Iraq understood what was happening before anyone else. As early as March 3rd, Iraq started shutting down operations at the Rumaila oil field, one of the largest oil fields in the world, because tankers could not leave the Gulf, storage was filling up, and there was nowhere for the oil to go. Kuwait followed. The UAE began diverting what it could through the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline to Fujairah, but that pipeline runs out through the Gulf of Oman, and Iran attacked the Fujairah oil industry zone on April 13th with a drone strike, wounding 3 Indian nationals and temporarily disrupting that bypass route as well. Qatar's situation deserves particular attention. On March 18th, Iranian missiles hit the Ras Laffan LNG complex. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all its contracts, meaning it legally could not fulfill its supply obligations. LNG spot prices in Asia immediately jumped over 140%. Experts estimated the damage to the Ras Laffan facility would take 3 to 5 years to fully repair. The world's largest LNG production facility was knocked partially offline by an Iranian missile strike. One analyst said flatly that this was the biggest supply disruption in the history of the oil market. Not the biggest since Ukraine, not the biggest since 1973, the biggest ever. Full stop. Now let me give you the actual numbers, because this is where the scale of the crisis becomes concrete. Before the war, Brent crude was trading at around $65 per barrel. By the end of March, it had risen roughly 65%, hitting its highest monthly increase ever recorded. Futures were trading around $116 per barrel in late March. The Dallas Federal Reserve published analysis estimating that a closure removing 20% of global oil supply would raise WTI prices to $98 per barrel and cut global GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points in the second quarter of 2026. Bloomberg's economic model projected that at $170 a barrel, the impact on inflation and growth would roughly double, what they called a stagflationary shock that could affect everything from central bank policy to midterm election outcomes. Analysts at U.S. government agencies and Wall Street banks were quietly beginning to model scenarios where oil hit $200 a barrel. By mid-April, futures had drifted back to $97 per barrel. Markets were pricing in a likely resolution. But physical crude, dated Brent, the price Asian and Middle Eastern importers actually pay for delivered oil, was sitting at $132 per barrel. Two markets, two very different stories. OPEC production fell more than 30% from pre-war levels. Oil output from Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE dropped collectively by 6.7 million barrels per day by March 10th, and by at least 10 million barrels per day by March 12th. Gulf states and Iraq were losing an estimated $1.1 billion per day in oil revenue while the strait remained closed. On April 22nd, Trump claimed the U.S. naval blockade had cost Iran $500 million daily. The Defense Department estimated Iran had lost $4.8 billion in oil revenue by May 1st. The IEA called for emergency stock releases. The U.S. and other governments released record volumes from strategic petroleum reserves. Saudi Arabia and the UAE maxed out their pipeline bypass capacity. The U.S. Permian Basin accelerated production, equipment utilization at its highest level since May 2025. None of it was enough to replace 20 million barrels per day. The Vitol CEO said in April that the war would result in 1 billion barrels of lost oil production. Current losses at that point were between 600 and 700 million barrels. European natural gas prices doubled almost immediately. Dutch TTF gas benchmarks, the European standard, nearly doubled to over 60 euros per megawatt hour by mid-March. The European Central Bank, which had been planning interest rate cuts, instead postponed them, raised its inflation forecast, and cut growth projections. Economists warned that energy-intensive economies faced high recession risk if the blockade persisted through summer. UK inflation was projected to breach 5%. In a remarkable development, the EU dramatically increased its imports of Russian LNG from the Yamal Arctic project, the exact dependence on Russian energy that Europe had spent 4 years trying to eliminate after the Ukraine war. In Asia, LNG spot prices more than doubled to 3-year highs on March 4th alone. Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, all heavily exposed. Bangladesh and Pakistan, whose electricity generation depends significantly on gas, began rationing. The Philippines declared a price disruption crisis and started a temporary 4-day workweek to reduce fuel consumption. Vietnam abolished fuel levies. Australia authorized a 60-day suspension of national fuel quality standards, allowing higher sulfur fuel to be sold domestically. At the grocery level, the Gulf Cooperation Council states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman import over 80% of their caloric intake. By mid-March, 70% of their food imports were disrupted. Retailers began airlifting staples. Consumer prices spiked between 40 and 120%. Iranian missiles struck desalination plants in Kuwait and Qatar, the source of 99% of drinking water in those countries. What started as a fuel crisis started looking like something else entirely. South America split down the middle. Oil exporters like Brazil and Venezuela saw revenue windfalls from spiked global prices. Oil importing nations faced severe inflation, transport disruptions, and social unrest. Bangladesh was projected to enter recession-like conditions. Pakistan's gas-intensive industries, including fertilizer production, began curtailments. The world's most vulnerable economies were absorbing a shock they had no buffers to absorb. Now let me walk you through the diplomatic and military timeline, because this is where the story gets genuinely complicated. By late March, Iran had moved from a full closure to something more calculated. Rather than simply blocking everything, the IRGC began operating what Lloyd's List described as a toll booth system. Ships wanting to transit the strait needed to go through an IRGC vetting process and pay a toll, up to $2 million per ship, in Chinese yuan. The choice of currency was deliberate. Yuan transactions bypass U.S. dollar clearing systems and help Iran evade U.S. sanctions. China, Russia, India, Malaysia, and other countries Iran considered friendly were allowed through. Everyone else waited or turned back. On March 27th, Iran formalized this further, announcing the strait was closed to any vessel going to or from the ports of the United States, Israel, and their allies. The International Maritime Organization reported on April 21st that approximately 20,000 mariners and 2,000 ships were stranded inside the Persian Gulf. Meanwhile, Trump sent ultimatums. Repeatedly, he threatened to destroy Iran's infrastructure, to bomb it back to the Stone Ages. Iran's Revolutionary Guards responded that the strait would not be opened to the enemies of the nation through what they called the ridiculous spectacle of the President of the United States. On April 7th, China and Russia vetoed a UN Security Council resolution drafted by Bahrain that called for an end to Iranian attacks and coordinated defensive shipping access. China called for freedom of navigation as the shared call of the international community while simultaneously blocking the mechanism to enforce it. U.S. and Iranian negotiators met in Islamabad on April 11th and 12th. J.D. Vance led the U.S. side. The talks ended without agreement. On April 12th, Vance announced they had failed. Trump said he no longer cared about negotiations. On April 13th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the United States imposed its own naval blockade, not on the strait itself, but on ships entering or exiting Iranian ports. CENTCOM deployed over 10,000 personnel, more than a dozen warships, and dozens of aircraft. The operation was named Project Freedom. In the first 24 hours, 6 commercial ships were redirected back to Iranian ports. No vessels attempted to breach the blockade. CENTCOM later reported it had redirected 94 commercial vessels and disabled 4 that tried to breach it. There were now 2 blockades operating simultaneously in one of the world's most critical waterways. One Iranian, one American. What followed was weeks of escalating incidents. On April 17th, Iran announced the strait was briefly open, tied to a ceasefire in Lebanon. Oil prices dropped 11% in hours. Trump posted on Truth Social saying the strait was completely open. Within 24 hours, IRGC gunboats were firing on vessels trying to transit, Indian, French, and UK-flagged ships. Iran closed it again, citing the U.S. refusal to lift its own blockade on Iranian ports. On April 22nd, an Iranian gunboat attacked a Greek cargo ship off the coast of Oman after giving it permission to cross. The Indian-flagged tanker Sanmar Herald came under fire from 2 Iranian gunboats, despite receiving prior clearance. The container ship CMA-CGM Everglade reported damage from a rocket attack. A cruise ship, the Mindshift 4, reported a near miss and said the IRGC had threatened via VHF radio to fire at and destroy it. 3 Indian sailors were killed when the U.S. struck the Palau-flagged tanker Setabelo, which CENTCOM said was transporting oil from Iran in violation of the blockade. India's foreign ministry summoned a senior U.S. diplomat in protest and filed a formal complaint with Tehran as well. Spain's defense minister said the blockade makes no sense. France broke publicly with the U.S. operation. The UK, Australia, and the EU said they could not support it and preferred de-escalation. Spain's defense minister added something that stuck with me. She said that since this war started, nothing makes sense. That is not the kind of statement you expect from a NATO defense minister about a US-led operation. But it reflects what a lot of governments were thinking privately. Then something that has not been reported nearly enough. The IRGC had laid sea mines in the strait in March. By May, according to one intelligence report, Iran had lost track of where some of those mines were. The U.S. Navy began mine clearance operations, which Iran accused of being a pretext for military presence it did not want in the area. Even if both sides wanted the strait fully open, physically clearing untracked mines takes time, and it requires the side that laid them to cooperate, which Iran had no incentive to do under pressure. The physical hazard in the water did not disappear when the diplomats shook hands. On May 29th, the U.S. lifted its naval blockade on Iranian ports. This was one of the conditions being negotiated for a broader ceasefire. Vance went to Switzerland. Talks resumed, and on June 17th, Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed a memorandum of understanding. Here is what the MOU actually says. Iran will allow commercial vessels to transit the Strait of Hormuz toll-free for 60 days only. After those 60 days, future administration and maritime services would be determined by Iran in coordination with Oman and other regional partners. That language is deliberately vague. It could mean continued free passage. It could mean Iran reasserts control over who pays what to transit. Nobody is entirely sure. The U.S. lifted its blockade on Iranian ports. Iranian oil exports resumed, now free of U.S. sanctions under the agreement. Iranian oil revenues started flowing again. CENTCOM said U.S. naval forces would remain in the area to ensure terms were followed. The document also mentions the Lebanon ceasefire, which requires Israeli cooperation, and Israel is not a party to the MOU. It references a proposed $300 billion reconstruction and development fund for Iran, and it includes a commitment to IAEA nuclear inspectors returning to Iran. VP Vance noted a lot of great progress on nuclear talks. Iran's foreign minister said there was no discussion of details and that nuclear negotiations had not begun. Those two statements were describing the same conversation in Geneva. What actually happened in the days after June 17th was telling. On the first full day of commercial reopening, traffic hit a 2-month high, 25 transits, according to shipping analytics firm AXS Marine, mostly Chinese-affiliated vessels. By Sunday, June 22nd, it was back down to 12 transits. 5 of 8 inbound vessels had switched off their AIS transponders, going dark, hugging the Omani coastline to avoid Iranian detection. Maritime intelligence firm Windward described the traffic profile as looking like the late blockade baseline more than a functioning open strait. Iran fired on 2 more ships it said were passing illegally. The Lebanon fighting that the MOU was supposed to stop resumed within 24 hours of signing. Trump posted that Iran had better stop its proxies, or he would hit Iran very hard again, only harder. Vance arrived in Switzerland and said the U.S. holds all the cards. Iran's foreign minister said there had been major progress on Lebanon. Qatar and Pakistan issued a joint statement calling the Switzerland results positive and constructive. A communication line between the U.S. and Iran was established to avoid incidents and miscommunication in the strait. A deconfliction cell was set up to manage ship passages, and Trump said the MOU was not final, adding that if he did not like how things went, they would go right back to dropping bombs. That is the deal that is currently holding the Strait of Hormuz open. Even if it holds, some of the damage from the past 4 months cannot be undone quickly. The LNG situation is the one that concerns me most in the medium term. The IEA estimated that the Ras Laffan facility attack caused a cumulative loss of around 120 billion cubic meters of LNG supply between 2026 and 2030. The damage requires 3 to 5 years to fully repair. The world was counting on a global LNG supply wave, primarily from Qatar and North American facilities, to ease the tight market through this decade. Qatar's portion of that wave has been significantly delayed. That is not a market story that resolves when a ceasefire is signed. Europe entered this crisis with gas storage at just 30% capacity, historically low following a harsh winter. The ECB postponed rate cuts. UK inflation is projected at 5% or above. Industrial output in the UK and EU has been hit with surcharges of up to 30% in chemical and steel manufacturing. And Europe increased Russian LNG imports sharply in the first 4 months of 2026. A direct reversal of years of policy aimed at reducing Russian energy dependence after the Ukraine war. That is a geopolitical own goal that nobody wanted, but everyone chose because there was no other option. The fertilizer supply disruption hit precisely when Northern Hemisphere planting season was beginning. Over 30% of global urea trade transits the Strait. The IMF estimated that in low-income countries, where food accounts for 43% of household consumption, any fertilizer-driven spike in food prices was not just an economic problem, but a socio-political one. The Kiel Institute published analysis saying that every week the strait remained closed, developing countries lost real income that could not be recovered through subsequent market adjustment. The U.S. defense industry encountered near-total disruption of critical mineral supply, particularly sulfur, through the strait. China, processing significant sulfuric acid, banned exports in response, impacting copper production in Chile and elsewhere. Helium, roughly 1/3 of global supply comes from Qatar's LNG processing, was disrupted, affecting medical equipment and semiconductor manufacturing. One crisis feeding into another. The Brookings Institution published analysis stating clearly that there are no short-term policy solutions to this crisis besides ending the war. You cannot release enough oil from strategic reserves to replace 15 to 20 million barrels per day indefinitely. You cannot increase U.S. shale production fast enough to compensate. You cannot reroute Qatari LNG because there is no other route. The buffers were buying time. The question was always whether the war would end before those buffers ran out. Now let me talk about what the crisis revealed geopolitically, because this is where the longer-term consequences sit. China and Russia vetoed the UN resolution. China allowed its ships to pass through on Iran's terms, paying in yuan, benefiting from cheaper Iranian crude, while publicly calling for de-escalation. Russia increased LNG exports to Europe at higher prices, benefiting economically from the very crisis it criticized. India walked a careful line, protesting the killing of its sailors, filing diplomatic complaints both with the U.S. and Tehran, continuing to buy discounted Iranian crude where possible, while refusing to align firmly with either side. The UAE's departure from OPEC on May 1st during the crisis was a signal that traditional Gulf energy alliances are fracturing under this new pressure. Spain, France, the UK, and Australia all publicly broke with the US position on the naval blockade. NATO was conspicuously absent as a unified force. The UK and France proposed their own multinational mission to restore freedom of navigation through UK command structures rather than NATO, specifically so non-NATO partners could participate. On Iran's side, the position has been consistent from day one. Control over the strait is leverage. A professor at the University of Tehran put it directly, and I think it is worth quoting. Iran will pay whatever price that comes with that, because that gives you leverage. They mean it. Iran has spent decades preparing specifically to fight back through commercial disruption rather than conventional warfare. It does not need a strong navy. It just needs to make 21 miles of water uninsurable. That is cheap, and it works. The MOU was signed June 17th. That puts the 60-day window expiring around mid-August. In those 60 days, the U.S. and Iran need to resolve or at least make credible progress on, nuclear inspections, frozen Iranian assets, the $300 billion reconstruction fund, the Lebanon situation, and the long-term status of the strait itself. That is an enormous amount of negotiation to complete in 2 months on issues that have been unresolved for decades. The Solability economic model laid out 4 scenarios. In the optimistic case where the deal holds and the strait reopens fully, global GDP impact is projected at negative 2.19%, with $2.41 trillion in total losses. In the most likely scenario, what they called a phantom ceasefire where nominal terms hold, but the physical shipping premium persists, the projected impact is negative 3.24% GDP and $3.57 trillion. If the ceasefire, $7 trillion. If the ceasefire collapses, negative 4.38% GDP and $4.81 trillion. Full escalation to expanded conflict, negative 6.32% GDP and $6.95 trillion in losses. Even in the best case, the losses already incurred are measured in the trillions. What I think people underestimate is the permanence of some of what has changed. Iran has now demonstrated that it can and will close the strait when threatened. Every future military or political threat against Iran will be priced by markets with that knowledge embedded. War risk insurance premiums for strait transits will never fully return to pre-war levels. The risk profile of that waterway has permanently changed. Oil producers and importers around the world are now urgently building alternative routes, storage facilities, and energy partnerships with that reality in mind. Qatar's LNG damage means the global supply wave that markets were counting on to ease prices through 2026 and 2027 is now delayed and smaller than projected. That keeps gas prices higher for longer, for Europe especially. The European instinct to reduce Russian energy dependence ran headfirst into the reality that when Qatari LNG is disrupted, the only alternative in volume terms is Russia. That is a deeply uncomfortable position for Brussels, and there is no quick fix. The next 60 days may be the most consequential period in global energy markets in 50 years. I do not say that to be dramatic. The 1973 oil embargo lasted 5 months and reshaped energy policy for a generation. This crisis is already 4 months old. The full economic impact has not yet been felt by consumers in most countries. There are lags of months between commodity price shocks and retail price adjustments. If the MOU collapses in August, those lags mean the consumer price wave from the initial shock will still be arriving at supermarkets and petrol stations at exactly the same time a new disruption begins. That is the scenario that nobody in Geneva wants to contemplate, and that markets are currently choosing not to price in. What happens in Switzerland in the next few weeks matters to every economy on Earth. Keep watching this one closely. If this breakdown was useful to you, share it with someone who should be paying attention. I go deeper on the economic data, the diplomatic back channels, and the energy market implications on Substack and Patreon. Links are below. Take care, and I will see you in the next one.